Bible in a year, making it easier to understand.
And we are back. If you're just joining us, you've picked the perfect day to dive into the deep end of the pool. We're looking at Leviticus 25, verse 24, all the way through the end of chapter 26. John, I have to be honest, when I first started reading these verses about walled cities and price per harvest calculations, my eyes started to glaze over a little bit. It felt like I was reading a property tax manual from 1400 BC.
I know. It's like, who cares about the square footage of a Levite's pasture? But here's the deal, Steph. This isn't just a manual, it's a manifesto. It is a total, radical restructuring of how humans are allowed to treat each other and the earth they walk on. If you want to understand why our modern economy feels so, well, broken sometimes, you have to look at what God was setting up here. He's basically telling the Israelites, you're about to walk into a land flowing with milk and honey, but don't get it twisted. None of it is actually yours.
Right. That verse 23. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me, you are but aliens and tenants. That is a big, big claim. It's like God is the ultimate landlord and everyone else is just on a really long lease. But Stephanie, the listener, is wondering, why does that matter? Why would God care about the title deed?
Because if the land belongs to God, then no human can ever truly, permanently own another person's inheritance. It stops what scholars call latifundism, which is just a fancy fifth-grade word for when a few rich people buy up all the land and everyone else becomes a peasant. In the ancient world, if you had a bad harvest, you'd borrow money. If you couldn't pay it back, the rich guy took your land. Then he took your kids. Then he took you. And your family was basically deleted from history.
That's heartbreaking. It's a multi-generational trap.
Exactly. But God says, not in my house. He introduces the Gaal, the kinsman redeemer. If an Israelite hits rock bottom and has to sell his property, his nearest relative is supposed to step in and buy it back for him. The word Gaal comes from a root meaning to be released or purged from danger through a ransom. It's about returning the person to their family circle, or am.
So, let's talk about the math, because the text gets really specific here. If I sell my farm to you, John, let's say I'm in desperate straits, how do we decide what it's worth? It's not fair market value, right?
No, it's Jubilee value. Imagine we're looking at the calendar. If the next Jubilee, that big 50-year reset, is only 5 years away, the price is dirt cheap. Why? Because I'm only buying 5 harvests. If it's 40 years away, the price goes up. I'm basically buying a 40-year subscription to your farm. Verse 16 literally says, the more the years, you shall increase its purchase price.
So it's more like a lease than a sale. You're never actually buying the soil. You're buying the potential of the soil for a specific window of time.
Exactly. And that's why the redemption laws are so cool. If I buy your farm, and 3 years later you or your cousin get the money together, I have to let you buy it back. I can't say, no, I like the view, I'm keeping it. I have to calculate the remaining years until Jubilee and give it back.
That is such a fascinating way to keep the community stable. But I noticed something weird in verse 29. Walled cities versus unwalled villages. Why is a house in a city different?
This is a hidden gem of ancient sociology. If you sell a house in a walled city, you only have 1 year to buy it back. After that, it's gone. It's permanently the buyer's. It doesn't even come back to you in the Jubilee. But if the house is in an open village, it's treated just like the farmland. It always returns in the Jubilee.
Why the distinction? Is God anti-city?
Not necessarily anti-city, but pro-inheritance. In an agrarian society, the village houses were where the farmers lived. That house was tied to the land. If you lost the house, you couldn't work the farm. But walled cities? Those were commercial hubs. They were for tradespeople, merchants, expats. God is making a distinction between your livelihood, the land he gave your tribe, and your commercial assets. He protects the farm because the farm is your identity in the covenant. The city house is more like a business investment.
So the farm is sacred, but the city real estate is just business. That actually makes sense. But then we have the Levites. Verse 32 says, the Levites can always redeem their houses, even in walled cities. Why do they get the VIP pass?
Because the Levites didn't get land allotments. Their inheritance was the service of God. So God says, if these guys lose their houses, they have nowhere to go. He protects the priest from being squeezed out by the economy. Their pasture lands can't even be sold. It's their permanent possession.
It's all about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. I mean, look at verses 35 to 38. If your brother becomes poor, the Hebrew word there is muk, meaning to be thin or impoverished. You have to help him. And the rule on interest? John, this is radical. No interest on loans, no profit on food.
Man, imagine if we tried that today. Hey, I see you're struggling with your bills. Let me give you an interest-free loan because we're family. Instead, what do we have? Payday lenders charging 400% interest to the people who can least afford it. God is telling Israel, you were slaves in Egypt. I bought you out. Don't you dare turn around and start acting like Pharaoh to your own brothers.
Don't act like Pharaoh. That's a heavy one. But then it talks about people selling themselves. Verse 39 says, if your brother becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not make him work as a slave. John, what's the difference? To the outside world, a debt servant looks a lot like a slave.
It's all about the legal status and the treatment. In the Holiness Code here in Leviticus, they aren't called ebed, slaves. They are called hired workers or resident foreigners. You can't rule over them with ruthless severity. And here's the kicker. They have a hard stop date. In the Jubilee, they and their children go free, period.
Wait, John, I see a conflict here. Leviticus says they work until the Jubilee, which could be 40 years away, but Exodus says they go free after 6 years. Is the Bible arguing with itself?
That's a great catch. Scholars have gone round and round on this. Some think Leviticus is the upgraded version, but others point out they cover different scenarios. Exodus is often talking about people sold by the court, like a thief who can't pay back what he stole. That's a 6-year sentence. But Leviticus is talking about the extreme poverty case, the guy who has already sold his farm and has nothing left. If you let him go after 6 years, he still has no farm. He'd just starve. So he stays until the Jubilee, because that is when he gets his land back and can actually be a free man again.
Oh, so the longer service is actually a protection? It ensures he doesn't get released into a vacuum where he's just poor all over again.
Exactly. It's a safety net until the reset. It's about ensuring that the redemption is real and sustainable. God is looking at the long game.
It's a lot of laws, John, but it all points back to that one thing. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. We belong to the one who rescued us.
Man, that is the hook. But wait until we get to the modern mirror after the break. I found some stuff about 18th century debtors' prisons and current-day bankruptcy that will make these verses feel like they were written yesterday.
I'm ready. Let's take a quick break to let our brains cool down. We'll be right back.
And we are back. Stephanie, I spent all night looking at the history of bankruptcy, and I am officially a Jubilee nerd, because if you think debt forgiveness is a modern idea, you're in for a shock.
I believe you, John. But honestly, most people hear Jubilee and they think of a celebration or maybe a flavor of ice cream. They don't think about the discharge of unsecured liabilities.
Right? But here's the modern mirror. Think about the phrase fresh start. That is the cornerstone of the American bankruptcy system. But before we had the 1978 Bankruptcy Code, things were grim. In 1829, there were 7,000 people sitting in London prisons just because they couldn't pay their bills. You literally went to jail for being poor.
And that was only 200 years ago. So, what changed? How did we get from debtor's prison to the fresh start?
We basically rediscovered the sabbatical principle. Early English law finally added a discharge of debt in 1705. Not because they were being nice, but because they realized that if you keep everyone in jail, the economy dies. They needed risk-taking entrepreneurs. But the Bible was way ahead of them. God said, if you want a dynamic community, you can't have permanent debt.
So the Jubilee is like the grandfather of bankruptcy?
It's the super sabbatical. In modern terms, we have different chapters of bankruptcy. Chapter 7 is a liquidation. You give up your stuff to wipe the slate. Chapter 13 is a reorganization. But Jubilee? It was a Chapter 50. It was a generational reset for the entire nation at once.
Okay, let's talk about the force majeure thing you mentioned earlier, because I looked that up. It's French for superior force, or an act of God. How does that connect to Leviticus 25?
This is the kicker. In modern contracts, like for the NBA or a commercial lease, there's often a clause that says, if a disaster happens that nobody could predict, the contract is suspended. The NBA called it the Doomsday Clause. But in Leviticus, The Jubilee is a hope clause. It acknowledges that acts of God, a drought, a famine, a plague, can wreck a family's finances.
So instead of just letting the market crush the person who had a bad year, God builds a contractual exit into the law. He says, the debt isn't forever because I'm the one who ultimately controls the harvests.
Exactly. Now, check this out. I made a table comparing our modern out clauses with the Levitical ones. It's fascinating how we've tried to replicate this balance.
Looking at that, it makes you realize that God was the first contract lawyer. He was setting up these limitations of liability to protect the little guy from the big banks of the ancient world.
Totally. And think about the predatory lending aspect. Today, we have indemnity clauses that can lead to multi-million-dollar claims if you aren't careful. But God tells the Israelites, don't be a predator. If your brother is poor, don't take interest. Don't exploit his vulnerability. He's basically banning the subprime mortgage crisis 3,000 years before it happened.
You know, I heard a story on a podcast about a woman whose family lost their house in the 2008 crisis because of one of those subprime loans. She said it wasn't just losing the house. It was the shame, the feeling that they were lesser than because they couldn't pay.
And that is exactly what the Jubilee addresses. It removes the shame by making the reset automatic and communal. It wasn't just you failing. It was the year of liberty for everyone. It restored your dignity and agency.
But John, what about the driven leaf? You teased that before the break. How does a modern person experience that faintness of heart God talks about in chapter 26?
Oh man, think about credit card debt anxiety. Americans reached an all-time high in debt recently. When you're buried under a number you can't pay, every phone call from an unknown number feels like a sword. You start hiding from debt collectors and your heart gets faint.
The sound of a windblown leaf will put them to flight. If you're terrified of the mail arriving or the phone ringing, you're living in that paranoia.
Right. God is saying that when we walk away from his economic holiness, when we become greedy, or when we allow ourselves to be enslaved to debt, we lose our peace. We become skittish as prey. The people who were supposed to chase thousands are now running from nothing.
It's a spiritual and psychological collapse. It's what happens when you try to be the owner of your life instead of the tenant of God's grace.
Man, we're getting deep now, but we have to talk about how this all points to Jesus, because he's the one who finally stands up and says, the Jubilee is here, and I'm the one paying the bill.
I can't wait for that. Let's take one more break and then wrap this up with the eschatological hope, another fifth-grade word we're going to explain. Stick around. And we are back. We have covered property law, bankruptcy, and even doomsday clauses. But now we have to get to the heart of the matter. John, we're looking at Leviticus 26, the big blessings and curses finale. And I have to ask, it feels a little tit for tat, doesn't it? If you do this, I'll do that. Is God just a big vending machine of judgment?
It can definitely look that way on the surface, Steph. It's that classic covenantal structure. You see it in Deuteronomy 28 too. But scholars who really dig into the Hebrew, like in the Word of the Luminaries or the Damascus document, argue that chapter 26 isn't just a list of punishments, it's a teleological paradigm.
Okay, domain expert. Translate that into text message English for me.
It means the punishment has a purpose. It's pedagogical punishment. It's designed to lead to a specific end, repentance. God isn't just mad. He's a father trying to discipline his wayward kids back to the table. The curses are progressive because God keeps giving them exit ramps.
Exit ramps. I like that. So it starts with disease and panic, then drought, then wild beasts, then siege, and finally, exile. But even in the exile, in the lands of their enemies, God says something incredible in verse 44. Yet for all that, I will not spurn them, neither will I abhor them, so as to destroy them utterly and break my covenant with them.
That is the golden thread. Scholars call this the interconnectedness of the covenants. Here's the hidden gem. Israel might break the Mosaic covenant, the rules of the house, but God will never break the Abrahamic covenant, the promise of the family. The Mosaic covenant is about how they live in the land, but the Abrahamic covenant is the reason they have the land to begin with.
So even when they're failing, God remembers the land because he remembers his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a reassuring, optimistic ending to a very scary chapter.
It totally is. Now, let's talk about the sound of a driven leaf again. Verse 36. This is the psychological exile. The Hebrew word for faintness there is morak, and it points to a divinely induced terror. These are people who have lost their internal compass. They are fleeing when no one pursues.
It's the ultimate opposite of the Jubilee. In the Jubilee, you return to your own property and find rest. In the curse, you perish among the nations, and the land consumes you. It's like the universe itself is rejecting you because you've rejected the Creator.
But wait, there's a linguistic link here that blew my mind. The word for liberty in the Jubilee is doror. In Exodus 30, doror is used to describe fine flowing myrrh for the holy anointing oil.
Wait, liberty and perfume? How do those connect?
Doror means free-flowing or unrestrained. It's the opposite of being bound or congealed. When Jesus stands up in Luke 4 and says, I have come to proclaim doror to the captives, he's saying, I am the anointing oil that breaks the bond. I am the life that starts flowing again.
That is so beautiful. So the Jubilee isn't just about getting your dirt back. It's about getting your life back. It's about going from being congealed in debt and sin to flowing in the grace of God.
Exactly. And think about the sabbatical principle. The whole reason the land had to rest every 7 years, and the whole reason the Jubilee existed, was to remind Israel that God is the Lord of both space and time. When we don't rest, when we become slaves to the grind, we are basically saying, God, I don't trust you to provide. I have to do it all myself.
Slaves to the grind. That is a modern-day Pharaoh if I've ever heard one. We work 80 hours a week to pay off the interest on things we didn't need, and then we wonder why we're fainting at the sound of a driven leaf.
Man, that's a sermon right there. But here's the actionable takeaway for our listeners. Jesus said, My yoke is easy and my burden is light. He is our perpetual Jubilee.
So, if we're feeling thin or impoverished in our spirits today, we don't have to wait 50 years. We can go to the kinsman redeemer now.
He's our elder brother who redeemed what our first parents lost in Eden. He bought back our inheritance with his own life. So, if you're living in fear, if you're running from a sword that isn't there, stop. Listen for the trumpet. The year of favor has been proclaimed.
The year of favor has been proclaimed. John, I feel like I just had a mortgage-burning party for my soul.
I love it. Let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot of real estate today, from the walls of Jerusalem to the halls of modern bankruptcy courts. But the bottom line is always the same. You are God's servant, and He has already paid for your freedom.
Thank you for joining us for Day 56. We'll be back tomorrow to finish the book of Leviticus. Can you believe we're almost through it?
We survived the priests and the plagues. Numbers, here we come. But for today, just breathe. You're home.
See you tomorrow.